right, how's everybody doing? Don't think you'll be able to hear it, but if you hear a bunch of screaming, I just moved and my back window butts up against a playground, so that's what that is. Um, so, I hope everyone's doing well. Keep in mind that I did post the final paper assignment last week, and there's a discussion post about posting your end, posting what author you would like to do. So make sure you do that, and I'll respond to you. Um, Next week, I will post a short, assignment, probably just like 10 points about, just tell me where you're at with your paper so far in terms of author choice, research, what pieces you're planning on looking at, etc., just to make sure that everyone, is at least thinking about it, because since we're online and asynchronous, it's not something that I can, take half a class to talk to you all about. So keep that in mind, and obviously if you have any questions or concerns about your final paper, message me on Canvas. Keep in mind that we do also have a final exam, but it's only going to be 50 points, right? Your midterm was 100, your final exam will be 50, and then obviously your paper is the other 50. And like I said in the final paper recording, in case you didn't check it out yet, the final exam is not cumulative. It's just everything after the midterm, and it will only be multiple choice, true or false. There won't be any short answers or fill in the blanks. So you'll be doing enough writing with your final paper. And I will have all of your reading responses graded by Thanksgiving, if not before. I know those are kind of backed up. It's kind of been a hectic couple weeks. But yeah, so creative nonfiction, right? We're going to look at 3 authors this week. If you've done the reading already, you know that they are all very short, right? We have Hunter S. Thompson, Joan Didion, and David Foster Wallace. There are only a few pages each, excerpts from much longer pieces. I mean, Slouching Towards Bethlehem and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas are memoirs and novels. Consider the Lobster is an essay in a collection of essays by Wallace. But here, for creative nonfiction, we start with a David Foster Wallace quote, right? And he described his own forays into the genre as a process of peeling back my skull. Welcome to my mind for 20 pages, see through my eyes. So, we could argue that this is what any writer does, but it does specifically relate to creative nonfiction, right? Because sure, if you're peeling back someone's brain and reading a novel or a poem, that's a little different, right? I mean, it's fiction, it's more personal. The idea, as we'll talk about, for creative nonfiction is to talk about nonfiction, right? Talk about things that are true, but what's unique about creative nonfiction, which is right in the title, is that it's creative, right? I particularly picked the 3 authors that we're looking at today, especially due to their varying concepts of nonfiction, which really only becomes an issue with Hunter S. Thompson, because even though his facts were correct in his writing, well, we'll talk about Thompson when we get to him. If you don't know who he is, he was a wild human being, and kind of made himself a larger-than-life character in his stories, be them fiction or nonfiction, and then also in life, right? So the broad genre of nonfiction, right, includes a wide array of appealing topics from memoir to self-help books, sports history, cookbooks, true crime mysteries, to travelogues, travel books, textbooks, etc. Just nonfiction in general. But creative nonfiction refers to a subgenre of nonfiction that incorporates writing techniques, more closely associated with literary fiction. Right? So creative nonfiction writing tends to have an engaging, story-centric format that emphasizes narrative over a list of facts. Right? So even though it is a telling of factual events, it's written like a story. That's the easiest way to really grasp creative nonfiction as a whole. And this makes creative nonfiction markedly different, right, from other types of books associated with the nonfiction genre, like, again, academic textbooks. So, there are a handful of characteristics of creative nonfiction, right? Creative nonfiction is regarded by some readers as a more engaging form of nonfiction, which makes sense, right? Here are some of the defining characteristics. Emphasis on building a narrative, maybe the most important characteristic of creative nonfiction, right? You're responding to stories, not just facts. Your avoidance of overly technical terms, right? So you don't need to master the nomenclature or the specific language to understand a topic or a conceptual level. For instance, a reader can learn about exciting breakthroughs in the world of gene therapy without knowing the difference between cytosine and adenine. This also kind of goes hand in hand, just as an aside, with um, scholarly sources, right? I mean, you've all delved enough into scholarly sources at this point in your academic career when doing research papers to know that a lot of the time they're very dry and very droll and very dense, which is, they're filled with facts, but it's kind of hard to dig through them for that reason. And University of Virginia years ago was trying to start not a program as in like a major, but a program at the school where they were trying to make scholarly sources more engaging and more interesting and, dare I say, more fun to read. And that kind of fell apart because it was almost impossible, especially, for more scientific, scholarly sources. You can use firsthand accounts from real world characters who were emotionally invested in the story's outcome. This is another really important one. Readers want to hear from the characters who actually lived through the story, which in the 3 examples that we're going to look at this week, on different varying levels, all of our writers have truly lived through what they're writing about. These characters' points of view can be gleaned via interviews if they're dead, primary source documents from the time period, etc. Often explains the author's personal connection to the subject matter, right? Slouching Towards Bethlehem, the Joan Didion excerpt that you looked at, is all about her living through the Haight-Ashbury scene in San Francisco in the 60s and into the 70s. Hunter S. Thompson's crazy trip to Las Vegas to look for the dying or dead version of, or, a mutated version of what the American dream has become in his mind at that time, in the 70s. I mean, he's in it. Altered most of the time, but he's there. And it must be based on fact with no embellishments that would lessen its veracity, right? So nothing undermines nonfiction books more than including factual inaccuracies or exaggerations. Again, something that we'll have to discuss a little bit when reading Hunter S. Thompson, at least within his larger works. His political essays were pretty spot on, but we'll talk about gonzo journalism when we get there. So, subgenres of creative nonfiction, right? We have history, biography, autobiographies, and memoir, travel guides and travelogues, journalism, and humor and commentary. 4 golden rules of writing creative nonfiction. Now, I know this is not a writing class, but creative nonfiction if you are into creative writing, and don't want to have to just make up a story completely on your own, is a really great way to kind of delve into this creative world, right? Um, you want to make sure that everything is factually accurate, right? So even though writing creative nonfiction shares certain characteristics with writing fiction, writers should make sure that everything they write is factually accurate. Obviously, if this complicates things or proves too hard for you, the writer, you can always consider writing a piece of fiction, right? You want to play with person, you want to play with self, right? Think about point of view. You know, we see our authors do that in the three examples that we're going to look for. You follow emotion, which is very clear in all three of the pieces that we're looking at, even with David Foster Wallace looking at the morality and, you know, ethical means of boiling an animal alive to eat it. And you, most importantly, you want to incorporate literary techniques. So one of the things that separates creative nonfiction in literary journalism from other forms of nonfiction is the use of techniques more often seen in the world of fiction. Elements of fiction that you might find in creative nonfiction include extended metaphor, allegory, imagery, synecdoche, and many more, right? Um, Literary journalism, right, sometimes called narrative journalism, is a style of reportage that presents true stories in a more narrative way, using storytelling techniques to create a gripping and personal form of journalism. Now, on our last slide, I mentioned synecdoche, right, which we haven't looked at yet, which is a figure of speech or trope that uses a part of something in place of the whole of something, or vice versa, where the whole represents the part, though it's used less in that regard. An example would be to refer as a business person as a suit, which is kind of archaic at this point, or wheels to refer to a car, right? Those are kind of touchstone examples of synecdoche. So, Hunter S. Thompson. This is an apt photograph of him for the famous journalist and writer that he was. Hunter Stockton Thompson was an American journalist and author regarded as a pioneer of new journalism, along with Gay Talese, Truman Capote, Norman Mailer, Joan Didion, and Tom Wolfe. Um, I did not assign the Tom Wolfe reading in the anthology, but I did post his essay on new journalism um, under week 13, and it's definitely worth checking out to kind of get a grasp of. I mean, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but in his words, what he thinks new journalism actually is. Thompson rose to prominence with the book The Hells Angels that came out in 1967, right? If you don't know who or what the Hells Angels are, they are one of the largest motorcycle gangs in the country still, and this was kind of at their nascent forming period. Originally started by World War II soldiers who just, had PTSD and just really couldn't function in society, right? And obviously, and not that, veterans get the help that they need now, but it was even worse back then. So, since they felt like outcasts, they kind of made themselves outcasts in a larger sense. So he wanted to write a book and follow the Hells Angels around, which was a pretty dangerous idea, especially back then. This is in the heyday of them just like running drugs and guns and obviously like getting into massive biker gang wars. And he lived amongst them for a year. It's a phenomenal book. It's a captivating, just kind of snapshot of a very particular time and place in our country. Um, and the book ends with him getting stomped by a group of the Hells Angels. And luckily, one of the larger members that he was hanging out with that had taken a liking towards him stopped his beating in this parking lot. And when he was in a gas station, he took a picture of himself, which you can look up. I mean, he's like beat to hell, and he demanded that that was his author photo. I mean, like his eyes are swollen shut. Um, so I think that's like a good introduction to the type of person that he was. Um, in 1970, he wrote an unconventional article titled "The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved" for Scanlan's Monthly, which was an old magazine, which further raised his profile as a countercultural figure, right, in kind of the death of the hippie movement. Um, I will attach that too if you want to check it out. It's crazy. Um, the whole idea was that he was writing a piece about the Kentucky Derby. He's from Kentucky, so he really fought to go do this article. He worked with Ralph Steadman, who's a famous English artist, and the whole idea was that he grew up his whole life thinking that the Kentucky Derby, is just filled with all these kind of rich, um, elitist, racist, old white people who just, spend the day being as depraved as possible. Um, and to cope with all of that, him and Ralph Steadman just get obliterated um, for the weekend, and that becomes the article. So, again, remember I said that in terms of truth and fact in creative nonfiction, Thompson's a wild card. Um, he's written other great political pieces, followed presidential candidates around, and those are very different than these types of pieces. But, an unreliable narrator quite a bit of the time. If you've read any of his pieces, if you've seen Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the movie, he's just out of his mind the whole time. He was an alcoholic. Um, there's a famous video of him reading later in his life, like his daily drug intake, and it's mind blowing that he didn't die when he was like 35. So there is that, right, to keep in mind. But with the Kentucky Derby as decadent and depraved, he also created what he called kind of a subgenre of new journalism, gonzo journalism, right? Which is a style in which the writer becomes central to and, for better or worse, a participant in the narrative. Usually a participant in the sense that ruffling feathers, to say the very least. Another great example about Thompson was during the riots in Chicago in the 60s. He wrote a very famous piece when he was pretty much an unknown journalist, and Norman Mailer and Thomas Wolfe, who I mentioned earlier, were there to cover it, but they were watching it from like the top of this, like luxury hotel, essentially, writing about this very low point in our country. And Thompson, went out into the riot and ended up getting thrown through a plate glass window. Again, the type of person that he was, right? But gonzo journalism is a subgenre of new journalism, is an unconventional style of journalism that relies on the reporter's personal involvement in the story. While traditional reporting relies on hard facts, standing to the sidelines, right? Gonzo journalism takes readers a step inside the mind and feeling of the writer as the story unfolds. And like I said, in most creative nonfiction, your writers are going to be living the experience, but Thompson took that a little farther than most people did. So the author is going to be the protagonist in gonzo journalism while simultaneously experiencing and reporting from a first-hand point of view. It's always going to be first person. The writer becomes part of the story, portraying events through their own experience, which offers readers their version of the truth, right? Now, Thompson always said that he always wrote truthfully about everything, but when you got half a bottle of wild turkey in you and you're on acid, that version of the truth is going to be a little skewed. But in terms of literary elements, it's usually exaggerated, it's pretty profane, and while the tone and the writing style may rely on hyperbole, usually humor, and normally quite a bit of sarcasm. Um, Thompson has famously said that gonzo journalism is new journalism on speed, right? So there you go. Now, to move to our second author, right? We have Joan Didion. Joan Didion was an American writer and journalist. She is considered one of the pioneers of new journalism, again, along with Tallis, Capote, Naylor, Thompson, and Thomas Wolfe. Now, new journalism, right, is a style of news writing and journalism which was developed in the 60s and 70s that uses literary techniques previously seen as unconventional in news writing contexts, right? It's characterized by the presence of a subjective perspective, which is maybe the most important part of creative nonfiction. And new journalism and gonzo journalism, therefore, in particular, is that it is always going to be subjective, right? And it's more reminiscent of long form nonfiction. Slouching Towards Bethlehem is a collection of essays by Didion that mainly describes her experiences in California during the 60s. It was published on May 10th, 1968 by FSG, and it takes its title from the poem The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats, which I will post as well, so you can check it out. Yeats being one of the most famous Irish poets of all time. According to Nathan Heller in The New Yorker, the book came about this way. In the spring of 1967, Didion was engaged to write a regular column for the Saturday Evening Post. At some point, an editor suggested that she had the making of a collection, so she stacked her columns with past articles she liked, a report from Hawaii, the best of some self-help columns she'd churned out on junior editor at Vogue, set them in a canny order with a 3-paragraph introduction, and sent them off. And this ended up becoming Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Slouching Towards Bethlehem is a phenomenal piece of writing. If you read Didion and like her, you absolutely need to check out the White Album, which is probably her most famous piece of writing. But this is kind of more new journalism, and the White Album is very much so more memoir in a lot of ways. But Slouching Towards Bethlehem, like I said earlier, the title essay describes her impressions of the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco during the neighborhood's heyday as a countercultural center, in contrast to the more utopian image promoted by counterculture sympathizers then and now. Didion offers a rather grim portrayal of the going-ons, including an encounter with a preschool-aged child who was given LSD by her parents. So, essentially what she's doing in Slouching Towards Bethlehem is showing that this whole kind of, beautiful hippie movement is as dark as the rest of the country in some ways. And she really exposes that in a beautiful fashion. One critic describes the essay as a devastating depiction of the aimless lives of the disaffected and incoherent young, which Didion positioned as a cool observer, but not a hearted one. Another scholar writes that the essay's form mirrors its content, it's fragmented in structure, and it resonates with the essay's themes of a societal fragmentation. In a 2011 interview, Didion discussed her techniques of centering herself and her perspective in her nonfiction in such pieces and said, I thought it was important always for the reader for me to place myself in the piece so that the reader knew where I was. The reader knew who was talking and who I was. At the time I started doing these pieces, it was not considered a good thing for writers, and in particular journalists, to put themselves front and center. But I had this strong feeling you had to place yourself there and tell the reader who that was at the other end of the voice, right? So it's, again, the idea of being subjective. You're interjecting yourself into the story in creative nonfiction, and in particular new journalism. And as much as you are reporting the story is your experience, right? And finally, we have David Foster Wallace. He was born in 62, right? So he published most of his work in the 90s and the early thousands, so different era. And he was he was a professor. He published novels, short stories, and essays. Best known for his 1996 novel Infinite Jest, which is almost 1,000 pages long, incredibly dense, and I mean, to be completely honest with you, if you meet someone that says they finished it, they're 50% probably lying. And Time Magazine named it one of the 100 best English language novels published between 1923 to 2005. I mean, it's phenomenal. It's just dense and very long. In 2008, David Ullen wrote for the Los Angeles Times that Wallace was one of the most influential and innovative writers of the last 20 years, which is undeniable. Consider The Lobster and Other Essays is a collection of essays by novelist David Foster Wallace. It is also the title of one of the essays. It's concerned with the ethics of boiling a creature alive in order to enhance the consumer's pleasure, including a discussion of lobsters' sensory neurons, right? So just as a hint as to how like tangential and scientific Foster Wallace can get. I mean, his use of footnotes is like mind-boggling. It literally ends up being a whole other novel, right? You should hop into the library and just grab a copy of Infinite Jest and just flip through it, because it is kind of wild to look at. So that is our lecture on creative nonfiction. I will have the discussion up of those 3 excerpts, as well as those other few pieces for you to check out. I hope you're all having a good week, and don't forget to figure out who you would like to write your final paper on.